Hi, students. Time for our last lecture. As I mentioned in a message to you previously, I'm going to be combining discussion of dawn and day into one lecture. Um, they obviously are part of the trilogy, so they relate to each other in ways that are important. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll start with dawn and just run through what I think are some of the important themes that come up, some of the scenes from the book, the characters, the history of the characters, the things that, and I'll focus mostly on the things that I think relate to Night, relate to the experiences that Elie Wiesel himself had that he discusses in Night, right, which is obviously highly autobiographical. And he refers to Dawn as his first novel, and I think that's significant. Does reinforce the fact that Night is very autobiographical. But both Dawn and Day, the main characters, the protagonists, are versions, I would say, of Elie Wiesel himself. And he kind of talks a little bit about that in the preface to Dawn, which I'll read in a minute. And we find out some background history on the two characters, Elisha and Eliezer, that I think reinforce for the reader who is familiar with Night that these are versions of, Elie Wiesel himself, possible versions of Elie Wiesel himself. So in the introduction to Dawn, he talks a little bit about why he decided to write Dawn, and I think Day is similar in terms of its, what motivated it. He says it's purely work of fiction, but again, we can see parallels to Elie Wiesel's own life. But I wrote it to look at myself in a new way. Obviously, I did not live this tale, but I was implicated in its ethical dilemma from the moment I assumed my character's place. Right? And that again does suggest that it is a kind of reflection of him, and that theme of reflection is evident in all three parts of the trilogy. Right? He talks about seeing himself in the mirror at the end of Night, and sort of not recognizing himself, sort of seeing a dead person in a sense look back at him. Then there's the idea of the reflection in the window from Dawn, and then seeing his reflection again as the protagonist in the painting at the end of Day. So obviously that's probably the most important symbol of the three works. So he says, was it difficult to put myself in the character's place? Not really. Suppose the American army, instead of sending me to France, had handed me a visa to the Holy Land. Would I have had the courage to join one of the movements that fought for the right of the Jewish people to form an independent state in their ancestral homeland? And we know that this takes place in Palestine, right, with the conflict between the Jewish people and the British. And if so, could I have gone all the way in my commitment and killed a man, a stranger? Would I have had the strength to claim him as my victim? So I wrote this novel in order to explore distant memories and buried doubts. So here is where he's saying that in some sense it's not completely fictional. What would have become of me if I had spent not just 1 year in the camps, but 2 or 4? If I had been appointed a capo, right, one of the Jews that had one of the sort of intermediary positions that involved cooperating to an extent with the Nazis. Could I have struck a friend, humiliated an old man, etc.? So there we really see, I think, um, again, why he wrote not just Dawn, but I think also Day as kind of other versions of himself. We know what he actually decided to do with his life over time. But these stories are other versions, other possible futures for Elie Wiesel, had the circumstances been somewhat different. And I think that that is really important to understand in terms of background to this, both of the stories. There's also a lot of parallel discussion of questions of suffering and of guilt. What does suffering do to people? What happens to people when they're put in the most sort of horrible circumstances you can imagine? I would say in my own reading that the three parts of the trilogy, and I think this kind of message comes through for me at least, particularly poignantly and Dawn and Day, that the world is not black and white, good versus evil, right? And what I mean by that is this idea that some people are just born good, saintly, whatever you want to call it, and some people are just born evil. I think he suggested that's really an oversimplification, and that all human beings, if they're put in certain circumstances, can do things that would be considered evil, right? By somebody who's not in those circumstances, by somebody who's sort of judging them from the outside. And that's a significant message. And it's a message that I think probably is for some people troubling. It makes it a lot easier to imagine that they're just good and bad people in the world, and good people were born good, the bad people were born bad. In some sense, it takes away your responsibility, right, for your actions, for what kind of person you become, if you think that it was just destined to be one or the other. And we talked a lot about destiny and questions of fate in the books we've read earlier in the semester. But when it comes down to your own actions, and again, especially in life's most difficult circumstances, what kind of things are you capable of doing? There's nothing we can say, for example, genetically about the people that became, members of the Nazi Party and committed atrocities, that you could identify the atrocity gene that, that they were destined to do what they did, or the same thing for people who become saintly. And we'll talk about what saintly means here as well, or people that are just good, right? One place that this really comes out, I think, in Night, that I think is then picked up on again in Dawn and Day, is the way that Ellie felt when his father was being beaten for, I think in one circumstance at least, it was not being able to march in step. And Ellie worked with him to try to help him to march in step, and he just couldn't seem to get it down. And instead of being sort of angry at the people who were beating him at were the circumstances, he suggests that he became mad at his father because he had to see his father being beaten because his father didn't do what he was told to do. And I think that's really significant, right? That he was put in a situation whereby his anger was directed more at his father than at the people who were beating him. And I think that is very suggestive. And then that theme is picked up on again near the end of the book, when he talks about somebody he knows who's lost track of his father, and in one of the forced marches at the end of the book, when they're going from one camp to another and farther west into Germany. And we discover that the son had seen his father falling behind, and the people that fell behind too far were shot or trampled by everybody else. And that in fact he had really seen his father fall behind and kind of forgotten about him. And so when he discusses that with the father, who was able to survive, as I remember the story, he doesn't want him to know that, yes, your son saw you and just kept going, but somehow Ellie recognized that. He saw the son moving ahead, noticing his father was falling behind and not going back and trying to help him. And so, and he doesn't want to be like that. He says, that's, I vowed that that's not going to be me. Well, at the end of the story, during the last few days, it seems, of his father's life, he does start having these thoughts, at least. And this is where I think questions of guilt are significant. And we talked about this with Freud. Guilt not just for one's actions, but for one's thoughts. And the thoughts that Ellie had, that the burden would be lightened on his shoulders if he was no longer responsible for his father. It looked like his father was going to pass. He was able to really hang on for a long time, and it seems like a terribly sickly kind of situation. So he was obviously a very strong person, and anybody who had made it this far in the concentration camps had to be, who had been there as long as they had. But the fact that he's, and then feels that relief, sense of relief when his father is passed, gives him tremendous guilt and makes him feel as it says in Day, lowly, right? His suffering led to lowliness. His suffering did not lead to saintliness. And again, I'll talk about that when we get to Day, because that's also a theme that's, I think, reflected in all three stories. So that's where we kind of begin here with Dawn. So again, I'll just talk through what I think are some of the important issues, some of the important themes here. One important theme that I think um, is also sort of in the background here is this question of Elie Wiesel's faith and what happened to it after his experience in the concentration camp. Did he lose his faith? Was it just shaken? Did he get it back? And this question of if we kind of imagine that Elisha and Dawn is a version of Elie Wiesel, um, do you still need to have your faith intact to belong to the kind of movement that Elisha ended up joining, this sort of terrorist group in Palestine? Would somebody who didn't have their faith anymore intact do that, or would you do it just out of anger, and anger maybe of having lost your faith or having it really shaken? So this question of the status of Elisha's faith, I think, is significant here, and I think inevitably leads us to ask questions about Elie Wiesel's own faith and what happened to it at night, especially when we think about that last scene of the story when he sees his face in the mirror and sort of a dead person looks back at him. What had died in Elie? What part of him? And obviously that's relating to issues surrounding his beliefs, his sense of his identity, his purpose, his life, his faith. All those things, I think, are sort of reflected there. So there are definitely, I think, things about the protagonist in the story, Elisha, that are significant, right? He does talk about the circumstances behind joining this group. He was living in the main character was living in France, as Elie himself did after the war, and was trying to move on with his life, wanted to study philosophy and be able to read it in the original language. So he was taking foreign language classes, but he didn't really seem committed. He didn't really seem like he could really put himself into his endeavors. He maybe wasn't ready yet. He was still in this kind of limbo situation, and a situation where things were just happening to him. He didn't really have a sense of agency, of control over his life, of purpose. He had lost that. So this is the kind of person one can imagine that might be a prime candidate to join the movement, as it's called in the book, because it is something that perhaps will give him a sense of purpose, a sense of agency. And I think it's even suggested in the story that that was one of the main motivations for Elisha, right? That the Jews were the people who were always having things happen to them, but to be people who could actually impact other people, make other people feel fear, was something he could never imagine would ever happen. That it seemed to him that the historical purpose of the Jews was to be the sufferers. And here was an opportunity perhaps to be on the other end of that. And I think we can imagine that the people that did join, these kinds of movements and have these kind of experiences, there probably were some parallels here in terms of what their motivations might have been. So he meets this a beggar, and Elisha talks about the fact that in that tradition, that a beggar, somebody who seems like they were down and out, or maybe seemed like they were living a different life from everybody else. Moishe the Beetle is an example, obviously, in Night. That those people could potentially be prophets. You don't want to just kind of push those people aside or ignore them. And this happens to Elisha in Dawn, and I think in a way that does reflect a little bit the messenger role that Moishe the Beetle played for him, both in helping him to teach him about mysticism and in being the messenger that nobody listened to, that said, you need to get out of Saget, that bad things are about to happen. And again, in telling his own story about what he witnessed. And he tells him that that he'll know in the nighttime, when it's nighttime, because night has a face. And this again is all a part of this major symbolism of seeing one's reflection and what that means, when and how one sees one's reflection. And there are obviously lots of different ways to interpret this, and I'll just sort of offer my own sense of interpretation here. Um, Obviously, if you think about it, if you're looking out of a window during daytime, you're less likely to see a reflection than if you look out a window at night, right? Just because there's no light coming through the window. So from a sort of realistic standpoint, it makes sense as far as that goes. But the difference between day and night, I think if we think about what day represents, it represents our public lives and our public self, how we act, how we the sort of version of ourself we are when we're out in public life, right, and interacting with other people. And it's not really a space for really a deep reflection and self-judgment, right? And people might do things during their in their public lives, their everyday lives, maybe because of their jobs, for example, that that are difficult for them, that they want to separate from their private lives and say, well, that's the kind of work that I have to do to make ends meet. I'm not real happy with it. If I had something else to do, I would do it. But this is my public self, and this is who I am. And if we think, for example, about Crime and Punishment and Sonya's prostituting herself, or the prostitute that we learn about in Day, who again is these people just trying to survive. That might seem an extreme version of somebody whose public self was different from their private self, but I think that it's all ultimately tied together. So that's sort of who we are at Day and what Day represents. Night is more of a sort of a private space, right? It's when you're at home, maybe with family, with yourself. It's a place of a sort of authenticity, when maybe you might say that you're, to the extent that this makes sense, it's your real self, your authentic self, when you're by yourself or with family and people who you're close to, versus that public persona self that you are during the daytime. And it's more of a space of self-judgment and self-reflection, and where you really have to kind of come face to face with yourself, as it were, and think about who you are and what you believe and how you're living your life, right? And those kinds of things. So it is, again, tied in with this whole theme of seeing one's reflection. When do you see reflection? What do you see reflected back at you? What does it mean, etc.? So this individual named Gad, who's as one of the leaders of this cell within the movement, is somebody who we think of the name, sort of Gad, and inevitably somebody in a movement like this is playing God, because you are taking other people's lives, right? And one might say that that's only the kind of thing that God can or should do, right? Have other people's lives in your hand. That human beings shouldn't take one another's life. And this obviously is what makes these kinds of issues really difficult, right? And how does somebody deal with their anger, with their frustration, and obviously legitimate reasons from Gad's perspective to be angry at the British people, and to be worried about the fact that if you had these pogroms in the past, this organized, systematic sort of persecution of an ethnic group, that could happen again. And when that question sort of comes up, what's going to happen if the cell that Elisha ends up joining, that's run by Gad, takes the life of this British soldier that they captured in a sort of an eye for an eye sort of action, after the British captured one of the terrorist members. Will things end up just kind of snowballing because of that? Will things get worse? Will we have more open conflict? Could another pogrom actually occur? The systematic persecution, in this case probably by the British, against the Jewish people. And you hear several times, well, world opinion wouldn't allow it. World opinion wouldn't tolerate it. Obviously, that was something that was said by the people in Siget when they were hearing the story from Moshe the Beetle and other people telling them about the mass genocide that was occurring. That can't be occurring. World opinion wouldn't tolerate it. The rest of the world wouldn't just sit on their hands and see the Jews being persecuted and all these mass murders sort of occurring. And another place where the story reflects back on Night, this belief that no, the world wouldn't tolerate it, allow these kind of things to happen. And this again goes back to this question of good versus evil, right? And there's a lot of gray area there. It has to do with the situations people find their lives in. Why did people who knew that this was occurring not stop it? The German people, people in other nations that might have been aware that this was occurring. And even though right directly after the war, people, especially in nations around Germany, claimed that they didn't know that this was going on. Later admitted that they did at some level in their government know that it was going on, and that they did sit on their hands and just sort of allow it to happen. And to have to think, why did that occur? Why did people allow this sort of thing to happen? So this is the position that I think Gad is in sort of here as the leader of this terrorist cell. Now, the way these terrorist cells functioned um, was that there was an overarching organization, the movement that you were a part of, and then there were these small cells that would be assigned, different kinds of tasks. For example, in this particular cell, destroying military equipment and things that might be used against the Jewish people, etc. An important part of this, because you did not want these movements to be sort of found out and taken down sort of all at once, is these cells didn't really communicate with each other. The idea was to have, that you would have at least the smallest bit of knowledge possible about what was going on, especially in the leadership of your cell and of the movement overall. So that if you were captured and interrogated, you couldn't tell them, right, about where the other cells were and how many people were in them and what the names of the people were, right? So nobody really, knows that. Only the leader of the cell, in this place, Gad, really knows who the head of the movement and gets the orders that their cell receives in terms of what they're supposed to be doing. And probably even he doesn't know the other cells, who's in them, where they are. And this is something that became very common in these kinds of terrorist organizations and underground movements. This was the way too that the French underground did their work in, for example, World War II. The Maquis, I believe, as they were called, at least at one point, because it was recognized early on that if you were in an underground movement, the least you knew about the group that you belonged to and the overall structure of the group, the better. And you see this in all kinds of things. You see it in the different organizations in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, with people who are working particularly for North Korea and North Vietnam, who had infiltrated South Korea and South Vietnam and developed these huge tunnel systems that were actually almost like small cities underground. It was the same situation there. You knew a minimal amount of information possible about what the group was that you belonged to. So Gad comes to see Elisha. He agrees to become part of the group and talks about this idea of it providing him a sense of agency. Gad is constantly saying, don't torture yourself. This is war with the things the group is doing. Of course, that's very ironic for Elisha. For him, the war is and was torture. He's had experiences that some of these other people in the cell that he belongs in haven't had before, of the experience that he had, living in the camps. And it also kind of suggests sort of that war justifies everything, right? Don't torture yourself. This is war. In other words, don't torture yourself with the things we have to do in this group and the lives that we're taking, because this is war and this is what happens in war. And that means something very different for Elisha, I think, than it does for Gad. And I think he does morally feel that it does reflect for him this problematic idea that war justifies everything, and that there's something very, very dangerous and very tragic in that sort of mindset of, again, somebody who had lived through the war. So he is able to recruit him, into the movement. We learn about some of the other people that are a part of the movement. And at one point, they tell their stories when they're sitting around at night, waiting for the daytime to come, or waiting for the dawn, I should say, when they are supposed to kill this person that they had captured, because at that same time, the British will be killing the member that they captured from the movement. And so, waiting for things to happen, waiting for this long sort of night, as it were. And one of the things they end up doing is talking about how their lives were saved in unexpected ways. And another major theme we see here that we saw in Night was this idea of pure contingency and sometimes luck, good luck or bad luck. Things just happen. They happen quickly. Split second decisions. How did you respond in this situation? How did somebody else respond? Um, when did you survive just out of luck, or when did somebody lose their life out of bad luck, or just contingency? And Ella's experience in the camp, right? The times that they could have left and decided not to with split second decisions, when Ellie and his father survived, when they could have lost their lives through split second decisions, when they changed the name, their ages, for example, and the work that they did that helped them to survive. So living in this kind of uncertainty, right? And so they're all talking about their lives being saved in unexpected ways. One of them, Job, mentions that he was saved by death because he was able to play death effectively. Gideon says that he was saved by God. He didn't want to disappoint God under interrogation. And so was saved by God. Alana, who is sort of the voice of the movement, she's the one that does the radio broadcasts, talk about how the British brought in several women who were suspects that they thought might be, one of them might be the woman who is the voice of the movement on the radio, and that she happened to have a bad cold that day. And so her voice didn't sound like it normally does, was unrecognizable, and that saved her life. Gad talks about the fact that he was put in a position where I think there were 3 Englishmen who had been captured, and he had to make a decision of which one of them to kill. And actually, he told them, "You have to decide which one of you it's going to be," and they actually decided that for him. And he says that if he had to have decided which one of those people to have to been killed, that he might have killed himself first. So again, these kinds of situations of, again, contingency. There is actually in philosophy a whole tradition, a whole moral luck tradition of philosophy. I don't know if any of you are philosophy majors. I know Bernard Williams, a philosopher, talks about this, and it's sort of an interesting kind of tradition. We typically think a lot about moral behavior, moral actions, the judgments that we make about people's morality. How do we judge them, etc. And maybe to an extent, Aristotle broaches the subject a little bit, but the fact that sometimes how people act and kind of moral judgments we make, and what do they do when they find themselves in certain circumstances, sometimes it's just a function of luck, good luck or bad luck. And again, it's a kind of contingency. And then Elisha talks about the fact that he was saved by a laugh, that this person was choking him, and that his head really swelled up and probably turned red, and he looked like a big red balloon, and that this person just started laughing, and was therefore forgot about the fact that they were probably going to punish him and perhaps take his life for something that he had done. And that reflects later on in the story with this question about whether or not this John Dawson, this British soldier, is able to make the people who captured him laugh. And why is that significant? Why is that important? And we can reflect back on how a laugh saved Elisha's life, and whether or not laughing is something maybe that can reveal your humanity to somebody else. Maybe it personalizes you, somebody that's able to make you laugh. The kind of social bonding and interpersonal bonding that the role that humor plays. And so Elisha asked this to Gad, right, when Gad takes this sandwich and drink down to John Dawson shortly before his death, because he's hungry and wants something to eat. And he comes back up, and Elisha keeps asking him, "Did he make you laugh?" And Gad is angered by that. Perhaps Gad understands maybe what Elisha's trying to get at there. You know, did he become a real human person for you, and not just a sort of somebody that we captured who's anonymous, or that we have kept anonymous, right? That we have been able to depersonalize, because again, it makes it easier to take somebody's life when you depersonalize them. Of course, the ultimate depersonalization is just giving somebody a number, as the Nazis did with the Jews, and tattooing them with a number, right? You become just a number. Everything about whom you makes you a unique, irreplaceable individual is sort of erased in those kinds of circumstances. Then Elisha is confronted with these ghosts from his past, which is a major part of the story. He thinks they're maybe there to judge him, um, or maybe to witness him. They suggest that they're not there to judge him, that they're there to witness him, because who he is as a person is largely a function of their interactions with him, and how that changed him as a person, right? And the kind of person he became from all different aspects of his life to that point, from when he was a child up until who the person he is now, and even sees sort of a version of himself. And you can see how he would feel that they're there to judge him, but they say that they're just there to be witnesses. And when he goes down the stairs and takes the gun with him to kill John Dawson, he tells these ghosts, "Can you just give me some time first before you come downstairs?" And they do. And then as it becomes a couple minutes or a minute before the appointed hour, they come downstairs, and they are there to witness him taking the life of this John Dawson. I think it's interesting to ask ourselves whether or not it makes it either easier or harder for Elisha to take the life of John Dawson, given his past, and given that that he was a Holocaust survivor, that he spent time in these camps, that he saw these people who are oppressing the Jews do horrible things against them. That might get a little bit at the fact that this is kind of an eye for an eye situation here, right? Which I think is important, right? And we think about morality and ethical issues about whether or not an eye for an eye is a justifiable way to act, right? If somebody does something horrible to you, you do something horrible back to them. What the different religions say about that question, about that issue of whether or not you should turn the other cheek, as it were, or take an eye for an eye. What kind of anger does Elisha have over what happened? Does he have any kind of desire for revenge? And at one point, before he goes downstairs, and it's during the night again, he does see his reflection in the window, which I think kind of foreshadows the fact that he is going to be the executioner. He doesn't know right away who's been chosen to execute John Dawson. He later finds out that it's going to be him. And I think him seeing himself in the mirror, in the window, when they're waiting for dawn to arise, is maybe kind of foreshadowing that he is going to be put in a situation where he has to come face to face with himself, and take ownership of what he's doing, and recognize that this is ultimately voluntary. That he's a part of this movement, that he's had to buy into what the movement is about and what it's going to do, and that it again is going to change him as a person, just like all of these people these ghosts, from his life, who come back to witness him taking the life of John Dawson, that he's going to have to face himself for what he's doing here. So as the hour approaches, he does decide that he does want to go downstairs and talk to John Dawson. This is, I think, it might seem really minor, but I think it's a really powerful, really important point in the story. That it does come to the point, and maybe some of it is his self-reflection, as it were, literally and figuratively, in the window, that leads him to say, and maybe the ghosts being there are part of this too, I need to come to terms with what I'm doing, and talk to this John Dawson person. And maybe he will become personalized to some extent. but somehow he feels like he has to do that. He can't just kill this person who's just completely anonymous. That really is a way of not taking responsibility for what you're doing. And that, again, that's what the Nazis did to the Jews, depersonalizing them, giving them a number, treating them as just these less than human persons or beings. So he goes downstairs, and enough time to talk with him briefly. They get to know each other. He really seems like a nice person. This makes it more difficult for Ellie, but again, he seems like he felt like he needed to do this. Talks about John Dawson talks about his son. He gives him a note and says, "Will you make sure that my family gets this note?" He seems to be a decent person. He seems to not take it out personally against Elisha that he was chosen to be the executioner. He knows how these things work, probably, and that he's not going to do anything necessarily to make it harder on Elisha. But he does become personalized, and that does obviously make it more difficult for Elisha. You might notice in the story, just before he pulls the trigger, or right as he's pulling the trigger, he refers to him as the hostage. He does kind of depersonalize him at that very last second, rather than referring to him as John Dawson. The protagonist sort of narrator here calls him the hostage. And I think that John Dawson is even sort of talking at that moment. And John Dawson, I think, refused to have his eyes covered while he was being executed, to see his executioner. That obviously makes it more difficult, I think, in some ways for Elisha to do this. So that's how the story ends. And I think, again, we necessarily have to ask this question about, is Elisha a hero or a villain, or neither? My own sense is that Elie Wiesel thinks that it's neither, because he is wanting to problematize this simple dichotomous way of thinking about heroes versus villains, good versus evil, all of these kind of things. I think, again, Knight and the other two fictional writings all sort of do that. And it just sort of problematize, because of that, what it means to be a human being. So that is the first of our readings. The next one is Day, which is also called The Accident. Let me, I forgot to put up on the screen here. There's a quotation, that's something that I already referred to, that I just want to show you briefly. Again, Elie Wiesel has been quoted all over the place for, mostly for things from Knight, but things from also from Dawn and Day, and things from speeches that he gave. And this gets back to this question of in this issue of what the messenger tells Elisha about Knight. Night is purer than day. It's better for thinking and loving and dreaming. In other words, for your personal life, your authentic person. At night, everything is more intense, more true. The echo of words that have been spoken during the day takes on a new and deeper meaning at night. And I think that at least is consistent with what I've said, at least in terms of how I view this this quote, this thing that this messenger, this beggar, told Elisha, that night has a face, and that's how you can tell the difference between night and day. This is well here is a different. It probably isn't the one that you have, but a different version of the trilogy. That obviously has Elie Wiesel's adult picture on it, and look at the cover, that the red and black cover, right? Clearly, that mirrors maybe most directly one's emotional response, one's state of mind in thinking about the kinds of issues and the experiences that are discussed, really, in all three of those books. Right. And I know that a lot of the copies of the trilogy, including the one that I often use, will have barbed wire on the cover, very either a stark cover or a cover that really reflects. Again, I think that the fear, terror, pain, suffering, the horrible things that human beings can kind of do to each other. I think it very comes to me, very powerfully with that cover of the book, but in a very different way than the ones that are just more the stark black and white covers, um, like the edition of the book that I use. So, so we move on to day. This is a longer story. I think I had it down for 2 days for us. And the protagonist here is Eliezer, and but we don't know his name actually until fairly far into the book. But I think we can tell that he is again another version of Elie Wiesel himself. And in this case, he is somebody who is also trying to move on with his life. He's a writer, which we know Elie Wiesel himself was. He writes for Eliezer writes for some kind of a newspaper that's talking about the different incidents that are happening. Um, and again, it's just he needs money. He needs something to do during the day. He needs a job, but it's not something that again he really can commit to. And we find out that this version of Elie Wiesel, Eliezer, has a difficult time committing to anything in his life, and in particular to interpersonal relationships. And one can certainly understand why that would be the case. And I'm sure that many Holocaust survivors had the same difficulty. First of all, how can I go on with my life? What am I going to do with my life? I need to have some kind of income. And you can maybe imagining them doing something very difficult with the rest of their lives than they would have perhaps been doing had they not had the experience that they did, during the Holocaust. So this version of Elie, not real committed to his work, but it's a job, and maybe him having difficult time really committing or throwing himself into anything that was more meaning, maybe anything too that had more personal meaning for him. He doesn't really personalize this job very much. Again, I mentioned that this was originally called The Accident, and we know that has to do with him being hit by this car, this taxi. This did actually happen to Elie Wiesel, though he claims that it was totally by accident when it actually really happened to him. I think it may have been like in the 1950s. But he says it was totally by accident. We know, obviously, in the version and the way that's told in Dawn, or as it was called, The Accident, that he allowed himself, the Eliezer character allowed himself to be hit by this cab. And we later find out in the story that that was right before he had agreed with this woman that he clearly loves to the extent that he's capable of that emotion, and having this long-term relationship with. When she says, will you allow yourself to forget about the past and live in the present with me, so we can have this relationship, because obviously they do have this very powerful bond between them. And he's basically said, yes, I can do that. And we know in the way that the story is told that he probably can't. And it's, I think, really significant that it's almost right after that he allows himself to be hit by this cab. Right, that reflects that he really cannot just kind of go on with his life and put his past behind him. And that is an issue, I think, throughout the story here. And even the quotation that appears before the story from Zorba the Greek, I think, reflects that. Again, at least it's in the edition of the book, the Hill and Wang edition of the book. I was once more struck by the truth of the ancient saying, man's heart is a ditch full of blood. The loved ones who have died throw themselves down on the bank of this ditch to drink the blood and so come to life again. The dearer they are to you, the more of your blood they drink. And this does seem to me to really reflect powerfully elements of all three of these stories. The fact that the dead for Elie are still for him living, in significant part because of the way they died, and talking about his grandmother in the story, and his other family members, the people he knew who lost their lives, that they're still with him, and they are, in a sense, still drinking his blood. They are still in his mind all the time. He still is suffering because of his memories of those people and the way they died. And they are sort of taking the life force out of him, like somebody would who's right sucking your blood, who's draining your blood, in this sense. And if we think of what the heart represents symbolically too, I think that's significant. And so these people are still with him, but they are taking his, as it were, his life force, his ability to try and live a normal life to the extent that that's possible, away from him, because of the fact that they are, still living so powerfully in his memory and interfering with his ability to throw himself into a career and to have significant relationships that he can really commit to, and be completely intimate with another person. There are questions of intimacy in the book that I think are really significant. For example, in seeing sexual intercourse as in some ways less intimate than kissing is. That's sort of an interesting idea. And another thing that I think um, is often a theme in the arts, the question of intimacy and what's more intimate. What are the different levels of intimacy? Freud obviously talks about those as well. And obviously, it's interesting to think about how Freud might interpret, right, the actions of really all the people that we've read about in these three parts of the trilogy. So he meets this woman named Kathleen. The circumstances that they meet are really fascinating. He was with a friend at a show, and Kathleen was as well, and seems like she had brought a date with her. And Eliezer's friend Shimon wants to introduce him to this person named Kathleen. And obviously, maybe thinks that they would hit it off. We find out that Shimon has told Kathleen about him too, and has said that he's basically a saint, because of what he has experienced in his life. Now, Eliezer's going to question that idea, but she does know something about him. So she comes over to meet him, and there's this instant connection there, where he says, no, we haven't seen each other before, but we already know each other. It's a very powerful moment in the book. It's like, what does that mean? Now, it does make a little bit of sense when we find out that Kathleen has been told about Eliezer from Shimon, but nonetheless, I think there is this very powerful, instant kind of chemistry that we don't understand right from the beginning. We find out later that it has to do with her being drawn to him because of what she's learned about him and what he's had in his life, what he's experienced. And in particular, in terms of his suffering. And here again, we can think about, Freud a little bit, and what is it about Kathleen that she's so drawn to somebody who has had this kind of horrible suffering. And we find out that Kathleen has maybe voluntarily put herself in a relationship sort of later in the story where she suffers greatly and is a different person after that relationship, and whether or not that has to do with being able to identify with Eliezer's life, or what it's like to be somebody who has suffered, in Eliezer's case, in an extreme way, and in a pretty powerful way as well, in terms of, we find out Kathleen had been in this really bad relationship that certainly was at least emotionally abusive. But here's this scene where they sort of meet each other, and this is where Kathleen ends up going back over to her date and saying, I'm leaving with this other guy, and he's not very happy. But they just decide to go for a walk together. They don't really talk a whole lot at first, but they go back to her apartment, and she says, I want to know about you. I want to know more about you. And this is where we found out that Shimon has already told Kathleen a little bit about, Eliezer and what he's like. And this is the beginning of us understanding this very complicated, maybe very unique and interesting relationship that they have. And Eliezer's hit by this cab, almost dead. It mentions that he was run over and dragged down the street. He was 20 minutes lying on the pavement before a ambulance came for him. One whole side of his body, basically all the bones were broken. It looks like he had some head trauma, etc., and is a really difficult, situation after this experience and after being hit by this cab. And so there's this question of his actions and his behavior and his experience and what it's like when he's in the hospital. And of course, we know that he has allowed himself to be hit by this cab and maybe wishes that his life had just been ended here and there. That's countered very powerfully by the doctor, who's, I think, supposed to appear as a very positive character. I think he's supposed to be likable. He's a young doctor. He's very energetic and motivated. He's thrown himself into his work in a way that Eliezer has not been able to throw himself in his work. He's obviously lived a very difficult life. It's significant that he's young and energetic, etc. In some ways, the opposite of Eliezer, based on his past experiences. And he really committed to saving lives. And he's totally... it impacts him very deeply, and his emotional state is impacted directly about, with whether or not, as an emergency room doctor, he's been able to save lives or has lost lives. He ends up coming to see Eliezer at the end of every day and talked about his experiences. And he talks about one day coming in and saved somebody who everybody else had given up on, and said that he can't survive. And he's going to lose a leg, and he has gangrene, and it looks like it's gotten in his blood system and everything else. But this doctor has been able to save this. I believe it was a boy, and you can see in that scene, and in other scenes with the doctor too, that he lives and dies with what happens to him in these situations. Working as an emergency room doctor, and must be a very difficult circumstances, and how emotionally he's up and down all the time based on whether or not he's been able to save these people's lives. And Eliezer starts to wonder whether or not he thinks perhaps that he recognizes that Eliezer tried to take his own life. Maybe did he say things when he was in and out of consciousness? We do find out that he has said the name Sarah several times. We found out Sarah was the name of his mother, and that in his tradition, it's important to remember the names of your family members, his mother, his grandmother, that they're still very important to him, as family is. And the scene where he ended up seeing them leave him behind on a train as they were going off to the camps, and seeing the train actually go up into the sky, and the smoke that's left behind. It's very, the chimneys, the ashes, all of that, I think, is represented in the symbolism of the train there. So he wonders whether or not the doctor knows or has been able to tell that he allowed himself to be hit with this cab. On the other hand, is the nurses who try and cheer him up all the time. They think that he'll feel better if he has a shave. On some level, they come across as superficial, but on another level, he recognizes that they have a very hard job too. And what they're doing is really trying to help him. They don't know what he's experienced. They can't identify with it. So I think at the same time that they come across to him, and he thinks of them somewhat superficially, and boy, they think he can just kind of make him happy, in a way that's even more superficial maybe than Kathleen thinks she can make him happy. I think Kathleen knows how difficult that's going to be, and that she might not be successful in trying to do it. But I think that has to do with interpersonal relationships and our sense of how we impact other people's lives and whether or not we make them happier, or do we cause them suffering and pain? again, interpersonal relationships and Freud, all kinds of interesting ways of using Freudian ways of interpreting what's going on there. And again, another big theme here is this question of the doctor sees death as the enemy and talks about it that way. Eliezer doesn't necessarily see death as the enemy. And so that's another important theme that when that idea of death being the enemy, who is it the enemy for? Right. So Kathleen and Eliezer are first talking. When she gets to know him, she says, "Tell me a little about yourself." He says, "No, you don't want to know about me." And he says, "You'll hate me if I tell you about myself." Just like he said it to the Englishman when he was aboard ship once, when they were looking out over the water on this ship, and he recognizes that he and this Englishman have both thought about suicide or are absorbed in the thought of death because of things that they've experienced in their life. And the symbolism again of the ocean and of the water. I know we talked about that with when Shelley's Frankenstein, that kind of symbolism of kind of being swallowed up by the water, going back to the womb again, the unfathomableness of the water, especially when you're talking about a huge ocean. And so, again, lots of symbolism there. But he does tell Kathleen about himself, just like he tells this Englishman. And so this question of why does he think that she will hate him if she hears about his story? And there are lots of ways maybe to interpret that. Again, I'll give you my own personal sense. I think it's part of it's what he represents and reveals about what human beings are capable of doing to each other and the kind of suffering that they can kind of bring to one another through their actions. And so he reveals a side of human nature that people in general don't want to know about, don't want to believe in, don't want to hear about. They don't want to be faced with it in their everyday life, and being in a relationship perhaps with somebody who represents that and has represents that kind of suffering and that, again, horrible things that people can do to each other. And also that you never forget probably the story, his painful story, right? Once she hears about his story, what he's undergone, that it's always going to be with her in some way. She's never going to be able to completely erase it from her mind. And it does seem like somehow Kathleen feels like she needs to hear this story because she's heard a little bit about him from Shimon, and there's something about her as a person too that she seems like she needs to hear about his suffering. So we can also think about this in terms of Freud with right, Thanatos and Eros as being the drive to maintain one's life, and Thanatos being the death drive, and the fact that Eliezer is struggling with that. What's going to win out in the end? Is Eros going to win out in the end, or is Thanatos going to win out in the end? He also, I think, represents that. And then there's this question about suffering, and that Shimon has told Kathleen that Eliezer is a saint, and that is somehow tied in with the fact that he's really suffered horrible things in his life. And he says, "No, I'm not a saint." He doesn't feel like a saint. He feels lowly because of what he's undergone. He's been put in a position, when we think back to Night, and this is where I think, again, reading all three stories is important because they all add meaning to each other. A situation where you got angry at your father for being beaten, at the point where you would have maybe done horrible things to another person for a scrap of bread. And there were some stories that Ellie told about Night and seeing people attack and maybe even take the lives of their family members for a piece of bread. And he's feeling relief at the death of his father because he was no longer responsible for him. And it sort of suggests that there are different kinds of suffering, there are different causes for suffering, that he has felt lowly because of his suffering and does not feel like a saint because of it. But perhaps that is possible depending on the circumstances. So he says, when Kathleen asks him about his suffering, and the Shimon says that you're a saint, he says, "Suffering brings out the lowest, the most cowardly in man. There's a phase of suffering you reach beyond which you become a brute. Beyond it, you sell your soul, and worse, the souls of your friends or maybe family members, for a piece of bread, for some warmth, for a moment of oblivion, of sleep. Right? And we think of the sleep that Ellie wasn't able to get while his father was moaning and groaning and while he was trying to see if he could still hear him breathing and if he was still alive. Saints are those who die before the end of the story. The others, those who live out their destiny, no longer dare look at themselves in the mirror, afraid they may see their inner image, a monster laughing at unhappy women, at saints who are dead. So suggesting that you only become a saint, when you die for this suffering. I think we've talked a little bit about this idea too in Crime and Punishment, about the suffering Raskolnikov has brought on himself, and certainly hasn't made him a saint, but he suffered a lot from it, versus maybe the suffering that Sonia underwent and having to prostitute herself for her family. Has that made her a saint, or if not saint, somebody is redeemable, who God will forgive for what she did? We think of the sacrifices that Raskolnikov's sister Dunya has made for him. So this whole theme of suffering and saintliness, in particular, I think is very powerful in Crime and Punishment, in the Freud that we read, Civilization and Its Discontents, and in the 3 parts of this trilogy. And that's the important part, I think, for Eliezer, for Kathleen, knowing who he is or getting to know him better and seeing what he has kind of gone through. So I mentioned the 2 Sarahs that are talked about in the story. The other one is this prostitute that he meets, who is a survivor. She's very young. And it's one of those moments where he feels like he needs some kind of degree of intimacy. So he goes to her room, and he just somehow he wants to hear about her. He wants to talk a little bit first. Maybe he feels like that's important for him. Even though that's not something one imagines one does in meeting a prostitute, right? That you would imagine you want to keep those kinds of situations very impersonal and not personalize them. And he finds out the horrible situation that she experienced, and being a very young girl, I think it was maybe age 12, and being abused repeatedly by the Nazis in the camp where she was living. The fact that there were these other women who wanted to put themselves in her place, and just how at 12 years old, how do you process that experience and what it does to you, how it makes you feel, and how you deal with it afterwards. And it happened to her multiple times, repeatedly. And she did, obviously, that's still with her, right? And this is now Eliezer in that experience of, in some sense, hating her, or at least saying, no, I can't hear anymore. I don't want to hear more of your story, because of again, what it reminds him, and what it not just reminds him, but hearing another dimension again about the horrible things human beings can do to each other, because of the suffering that she experienced and the fact that she is still living with it. She is not perished, right? As he says, only saints are the only ones who perish. Maybe it's possible to see her as a saint. She doesn't feel like a saint. She feels lowly. She talks about her body responded to these encounters that she had in a way that, her biology is responding in one way and her emotions are responding in another way, and how difficult that was for her. So that's, I think, very important part of the story, because it kind of puts Eliezer, in some sense, on the other side of these interpersonal relationships, but having undergone his own, immense suffering himself. So we get to that point in the story where he agrees to make this this pact with Kathleen, that he will allow her to make him happy when he starts to remember what it was like in that train station of a small provincial town like Siget, right? And seeing his family going off to the camps, and he never would see them again, that he would try to put that beyond him. We know that he's not able to do that. As Freud might say, these are things you have to find some kind of way of dealing with. They're still going to be with you, but if you try to push them away all the time and repress them, they're going to cause other traumas. And the traumas we know are very deep that Eliezer has experienced. And one of them is not being able to really have intimate personal relationships. Right? We know that Eliezer has, once he is sort of confronted by the doctor who says he didn't give himself away when he was in and out of consciousness in the hospital, but he says, the doctor says to him, your body, you didn't fight to stay alive. You know, other people, when they've, been in the situation where it's life or death, they in some sense, in their unconscious state on their operating table, they help me. They have a life force that's still with them, right? The arrows are still with them, but you didn't fight to stay alive. And Eliezer tells him a story about, having this dream of seeing God and being told, what the meaning of suffering is, and that he wakes up after this dream and he forgot what God told him, and that is, he's very, very sad and sort of disturbed at that. And he says that he had another dream during this particular encounter. I think the first one was having his tonsils out or his wisdom, I forget what it was, some kind of relatively minor surgery where he dreamt about God. And here it is again in this and being unconscious on the operating table. I think the first time he was 12 years old. And he says this time he didn't see God, right? Suggesting that maybe his faith is gone, or at least shaken to the point that he doesn't see God anymore. Maybe his faith is gone. How can God allow this kind of suffering to occur? Maybe if he remembered what God said about the meaning of suffering when he was 12 years old, he would be able to deal with what he's dealing with. Maybe he forgot it because maybe there was no answer there. Maybe what God told him didn't make sense, or was not something that he could understand or comprehend until he was already dead. It's hard to know. Again, lots of different ways to interpret that. Let me pop up just one other quotation that I have here. I think this one is from Day. And this comes up really in both stories, and Ellie seeing, or Elisha seeing people from his past in Dawn as he's going to take the life of John Dawson. And then also there's over the Greek quote and the idea that forgetting people who died, especially who died in the circumstances that he saw, is kind of like killing them again, and that he can't do that. He can't just push them aside, even though Kathleen wants him to, and part of him wants him to be able to have relationships. That for him, it's like killing them a second time. This is really important, I think, because it has to do with his friend Gila and what happens at the end of the story. So let's move into that a little bit here. So this friend Gila is very interesting. He's the kind of guy who just says what's on the top of his mind. He doesn't mince words. He doesn't tippy-toe around Eliezer. He obviously, Eliezer's comfortable around him because he's that way, because he doesn't maybe treat him differently. He doesn't treat him in a way that constantly reminds Eliezer of what he has experienced. And that he needs to have those kind of relationships. So on the surface, it seems superficial, but in reality, it's not. It's a very important relationship. It's maybe the most, put here in my notes, the most playful of the relationships, but it's also in some ways the most serious relationship of relationships that he has in the book. And so Gila says he wants to paint this picture of Ellie. So here again, another example of him seeing his reflection. And Gila too talks to him about needing to go on with his life. Kathleen really loves you. You obviously really have a close relationship with her. You need, from the benefit of your friends, people like Kathleen and Gila himself, you have some way you have to move ahead in some way. So what we know happens at the end of the story is that he shows this portrait to Eliezer that he has painted. And it's a portrait that perhaps looks in some ways like that book cover I showed you. It reflects his inner turmoil. It reflects, it's a very powerful, we might say, expressionist sort of painting, right? That reflects his inner turmoil and the horrible things he'd had to experience, and his inner being in some sense. It's not sort of, this is a nice portrait of you that you can hang, in your living room when you get home. It's not that. This is about catharsis for Eliezer, to the extent that catharsis can help him at this point with the deep trauma he has suffered. But it is supposed to be a cathartic experience. It's him saying, here, you need to come face to face with these people that have died, that you're still living with. And very powerfully, at the very end, he lights the painting on fire and destroys it. All it leaves behind are ashes, just like the lives of his family and friends that just resulted in ashes after they were put in the furnaces and murdered. And he's obviously says at the end, Gyla left without taking the ashes with him. I think that's significant. It's not like Eliezer could ever completely forget these people that are still going to be with him. The ashes are still there. He can't forget them. He shouldn't try to forget them. Right? To totally forget them is to murder them again, right? Or take their lives again. But in burning up this portrait, it's obviously very symbolic and cathartic here. It's okay. Through this picture of yourself, you come face to face with yourself, this reflection of who you are. And he burns it up and says, okay, now maybe psychologically, you can at least try again to go on with your life and at least not have the same kind of impulse to suicide that he obviously had, where he allowed himself to be hit by this cab. And again, the battle between Eros and Thanatos in Freud here. So, I guess again, I mentioned Elie Wiesel himself did get hit by a car at one point, but he says it was totally accidental in that circumstances. So, I guess at the end, do we think that Eliezer is able to going to go on with his life? What are the chances he's going to be able to go on with his life at the end of the story? Can he learn to quote unquote lie to Kathleen to make her happy, to the extent that he, when he starts thinking about these people that were still alive in the ashes, as it were, from this painting, can he at least push it to the side, or can he tell her that he's thinking about other things? Can he at least in some way be with her intimately, at least some of the time when she needs him, right? And when he needs her too, because obviously in some ways he really does need her. And so we're kind of left with that, I think, at the end of the story. So there is my lecture on Dawn and Day. I hope we could see from my discussion, and I know there's a bit of repetition there, that I really find it valuable to read all three parts of the trilogy. I know typically only students read Night. Again, I think it's in the curriculum in New York State for some schools. But I think that there are new dimensions of Night that open for the reader when you read Dawn and Day, when you read these other versions of Elie Wiesel and his life after, leaving the camps. And, then he's in France, and then kind of where does he go from there? How does one go on with one's life after experiencing what he experienced? I think new dimensions of that sort of become available to the reader. Because I think inevitably after reading Night, you want to know, okay, so this person went and wrote this book about their experiences. What's their life like now? Are they able to have relationships? What kind of career did Elie Wiesel have? And you might want to do some research on that after reading Night. And Dawn and Day give, again, these possible other alternative futures that he might have had. So I hope you found it useful and valuable to hear a lecture on the other two parts of the trilogy. my last lecture for the semester. I hope you found these lectures helpful. I found it was a new experience for me, but I think I learned a lot from it and was able to share these readings with you through these lectures. And again, I hope you found them helpful as well. So we will have the end of the semester coming up with your final paper and then your exam. As always, you can always contact me if you have questions about anything. So I hope the rest of your semester goes well, and I will see you hopefully at some point in the future, maybe in the fall.